Welcome back. Hit or miss, what you need to know on the Suncoast about Irma. Right now, it appears Irma will hug Florida's east coast. While it may be catastrophic in Miami-Dade County, the Suncoast could be spared from the worst. Meteorologists say anything could happen. So what do we need to know? Joining us is the man of the hour, ABC 7 Chief Meteorologist Bob Harrigan, Sarasota City Manager Tom Barwin, and joining us by Skype is Maury Goodman, the former Director of Communications for FEMA. Maury, thank you very much for joining us. And we've heard so much about FEMA over the last week or so because of Hurricane Harvey. In your experience, what is FEMA doing right now, especially considering the track of the storm is so uncertain?
Well, FEMA doesn't put people into harm's way, so they're not in the path of the hurricane right now. They're probably waiting at Region 4 headquarters in Atlanta. They're probably in the. There's a lot of FEMA people that are in the EOC in Tallahassee, the state EOC with the state, and they're waiting for the storm to pass so that they can go in because they don't put people into harm's way. FEMA really isn't response-oriented as much as they are recovery-oriented. So as soon as the storm passes, that's where the bulk of FEMA activity occurs.
And Tommy, you were shaking your head right now. Obviously, you have a big job in the next couple of days. People want to know, is Sarasota ready?
I think the state, the county, the cities are very ready. The state invests a lot of resources in this, and we're going to be watching very carefully for the next 24 hours. Inside of the emergency operations centers, we're waiting till Friday night at this time, and that's when the final, I guess, cone of uncertainty will begin to narrow a little bit, and we'll be able to be much more anticipatory in terms of specifically what will happen. But we're preparing for the worst, obviously hoping for the best.
I am literally the cone of uncertainty. Bob, obviously this makes it completely very difficult because we, at least on the Suncoast, don't know, what to expect. As Tom said, we hope for the best, prepare for the worst. It could get tropical storm winds or something less.
No, I would say tropical storm force winds are the best we can hope for right now. The worst case scenario would be hurricane force winds with maybe Category 2 status. It's too hard to speculate right now, but I would not be surprised to see that. And we heard earlier from a former FEMA director that they usually set up stages, and they'll be staging maybe in Atlanta. Well, FPL does that too. And if this storm were to move right across the spine of the state, there's no real place that will be safe in the peninsula. I mean, everyone at that point would get hurricane force winds on the East Coast and on the West Coast, all the way up to Gainesville, if that scenario played out, and that's the European. So this is going to be this is going to have a huge impact on the state, and depending upon where it moves, it's going to get worse on the East Coast if it stays there, and if it goes up the spine, everyone's going to get some impact, and if it goes up the West Coast, we could really be in trouble.
All right, we are just getting started. We'll have much more on Irma right after we check Bob's First Alert weather. Stay with us. Welcome back. Hurricane Irma is heading towards Florida with Miami in the bullseye, but we need to be prepared on the Suncoast, and joining us is the man of the hour, ABC 7 Chief Meteorologist Bob Harrigan, Sarasota City Manager Tom Barwin, and joining us by Skype is Maury Goodman, the former Director of Communications for FEMA. For all evacuations, we're going to be talking about that right now. Tom, we were talking earlier in the newscast in terms of the shelters that are going to be opening here in Sarasota and elsewhere. You have news tonight that one is going to be opening this evening. Why?
Well, just before coming on the show, I talked with County Administrator Tom Harmer, who has advised us that the state has asked the county to open a shelter here locally in Sarasota County as a host shelter for people who have to evacuate from other parts of the state. So sometime this evening, Brookside Middle School on Shade Avenue is going to be opened as a host shelter from those coming from other parts of the state.
I don't know if you could answer this, or Maury, that if you could answer this, but if you are leaving South Florida right now, coming up either from the Keys or the Miami-Dade area, how are you going to know what shelters in Sarasota or other parts of the state are going to be open?
I think the state has a messaging system, the county has a messaging system, all the local communities have messaging systems, and things really light up on Facebook. We're all communicating through Facebook these days, so there's quite a communication network that is formed. Now, general public shelters have not been announced for opening yet, but those are likely to happen. Booker High School locally here is a shelter, and I should mention Brookside is a pet-friendly shelter. Those announcements will probably be made tomorrow. If not sooner, there will be a press conference tomorrow morning at, I believe, 12:30 at the County Emergency EOC.
And I believe Riverview is also a pet-friendly shelter, if I'm not mistaken, in Riverview High School there. So that is a shelter. And I believe Pineview is no longer a shelter. So I've been getting those questions in. That is not a shelter anymore. And people sometimes don't understand that when you're asked to evacuate, you sometimes look at the closest shelter to you or school, and it may not be the case. So just make sure you pay attention to media, as well as social media and the county government's websites. They'll have it there.
Maury, over the last couple of days, ever since Harvey, we've been hearing that FEMA is running out of money. The Congress is voting on it right now. We know that the will is there, but what, if any, impact does it have on FEMA and its personnel if the monies are drying up as this hurricane is pulling into the state?
Well, there's no chance that FEMA will run out of money. It's disasters don't know Democrat from Republican, and there is no congressman or senator who will let a disaster go unfunded. So FEMA will get its funding, and FEMA always has an emergency fund. I don't know how much is in that emergency fund right now, but if they're running out of money, Congress will immediately appropriate a certain amount of money until there is a budget passed that includes new funding for FEMA. There will be an emergency allotment of money to take care of all the expenses that are necessary. There's no chance that FEMA will run.
We hear about FEMA all the time during tragedies like this or natural disasters like this, but I don't know if people in general know exactly what FEMA does after a storm like this. What is the mission of FEMA in terms of helping local people to recover?
Well, you might think of it as FEMA as the conductor of the orchestra. I'll give you an example. Hurricane Harvey, there's a disaster field office. They call it a joint field office now, which is the center of operations for all of Harvey, where all branches of government, all levels of government, state and local, the Coast Guard, the Department of Defense, the branches of the Armed Forces, Health and Human Services, all of the agencies of government co-locate there. In Hurricane Katrina, the Joint Field Office was in Baton Rouge at an abandoned shopping mall. And by shopping mall, I mean the kind of mall that had a Macy's at one end and a Sears at the other. A huge mall, and it was completely filled with 5,000 people working the disaster. Everything from satellite imagery to charting and housing. Housing is a huge part, obviously, as we all know, and it takes a lot of resources and a lot of partners to put the housing plan together and to launch the housing program.
All right.
So there will be a place somewhere in Florida, away from the disaster area, where all of the agencies will co-locate to manage the disaster, and FEMA does the management of all that, and mission assigns all branches of government, all agencies to do whatever is needed to be done.
All right, why don't we take a couple of questions from Facebook? Most of them are directed at you, Bob, no surprise. Leslie asks, what makes a hurricane change direction?
Well, it's the mid to upper level winds, okay, and not the water. A lot of people think it's the water that directs the storm because it's always looking for that warm water. It's not. It's the winds at 30,000 feet, 40,000 feet that determine which way the storm is going to go. And in the case of Irma, there's a high pressure ridge, which is known as the Bermuda High, which typically sits around Bermuda during the summer months, and the winds around it in a clockwise fashion is directing it at the base of that high toward the west. Well, it's just about at the western edge of that high where it starts to turn more toward the northwest. On top of that, there's a little piece of energy that's expected to develop and be left over from the trough over the eastern third of the nation. And that little piece of energy is going to be a counterclockwise swirl, and that's supposed to set up over the lower Mississippi Valley. So you get to feel that both winds are going to be going like this at the 30,000 foot level and 40,000 foot level, and we're right in between there, Florida. So they're going to converge, they're going to grab the storm and take it up north into Georgia and possibly South Carolina as a devastating storm. So the mid to upper level of the winds determine the direction of the storm. It's not the warm waters of the Atlantic or the Gulf.
Tom, I would imagine that the last couple of days has been pretty hard to manage in Sarasota. Just from personal observation, many gas stations have run out of gasoline, although they are being supplied once again. You go into local stores, water and bread is very hard to come by. At certain times, we hear that the storm is going off to the east. Now we're hearing it's coming back. I would imagine that makes the city's job a lot tougher.
Well, hurricanes are tricky. Our county director, Ed McCrane, has said this was one of the most interesting storms he's ever seen. For example, here in the city of Sarasota, we have about 2,000 hotel rooms. And earlier in the week, I know people who have evacuated from our community. Yet, when I went down to the Aloft, I met a family who evacuated here from Pompano Beach. And our hotel rooms on the mainland and downtown are virtually full. So we've had people evacuate from here. We've had people evacuating to here.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. They're making personal judgments based on the information that they're comfortable with.
And Maury, we only have a couple of seconds left, but I would imagine that makes, you've seen that before, and it makes things difficult. People are trying to get out of the way of the storm only to relocate to places where the storm is actually going to wind up.
Yeah, that's the another cone of uncertainty is where people are gonna go. The best thing to do is to get as far away as you possibly can, and not think that just going to mid-Florida or North Florida is gonna solve the problem and get out of the way, because it could be devastating in North Florida as well. So the farther you go, the better, and that's the word of advice for evacuations.
Right. We have to take a quick break. Final thoughts when we return. Stay with us. What do we need to know about Hurricane Irma? Our guests join us right now for final thoughts. Maury, I'm going to start with you. Obviously, your former colleagues in the government have been working very hard over the last couple of weeks with Hurricane Harvey. Are they up to now turn around and handle what's coming our way?
Well, I have to tell you, it's going to be a stretch. Two huge storms on the heels of each other is something that just doesn't happen very often. In fact, I can't remember when two huge storms like this have happened back to back. So there are a lot of contractors, and there are a lot of seasonal employees, or they call them disaster reservists, that will be called up, and they'll be probably hiring local people to do a lot of the work as well. And that's really good, hiring people who have lost their jobs from the disaster. But FEMA has a lot of staff in Washington and throughout the regions. There's 10 regions in FEMA, and people will come together from all of the regions to work this disaster.
And of course, Tom, people are going to want to know, is the city of Sarasota ready?
I think we're very ready. Over the next 24 hours, the storm picture will clarify. Then we'll have 24 to 36 hours before we actually feel the storm here. So there's 48 hours for people to continue to monitor, make good, smart, personal judgments. And in the city and the county, it's all hands on deck. As I said, we're prepared for the worst, hoping for the best. The new laws in Florida have all of our modern homes. They're much stronger. And our grocery stores here have backup generators, so they're not going to have spoilage issues. That's the Publix and the Whole Foods. So I think we're about as ready as we can be.
Bob, modern technology and social media is giving us the opportunity to answer a lot of your questions.
Right.
What is the best question that you are getting right now?
Well, a lot of people want to know if they should evacuate. And, it's not up to me to tell them yes or no. I tell them that the typical situation is that if you are in the zone that's asked to evacuate, that's when you leave. You hear the old saying, run from the water, hide from the wind. And what that means is that if you're going to be inundated with salt water, then you're going to be asked to evacuate based on the forecast models. But if you're in a storm that has 150-mile-an-hour winds and you're away from the salt water, you are not going to be asked to evacuate. A lot of people are jumping the ship, so to speak, and leaving here and going north, I think mainly based on what happened with Harvey. That's in their mind, and I'm getting out of here, I'm not going to stick around with this storm. But what they're doing is a disservice, because there's a lot of people trying to get out of here.
All right, we have to leave it there. We have already seen the incredible power of Hurricane Irma. Yesterday, it barreled through the Caribbean, leaving a trail of destruction and death. And two young women from Sarasota had front row seats. I spoke by Skype to Lauren Mayo and Holly Morris, who remain on St. Martin, where they were vacationing.
It was incredibly, incredibly loud. It really did sound like a freight train was coming through, and it was pitch black, so we couldn't really see a lot. But we sort of were putting our hands up to the glass on our balcony doors and windows to just see kind of like
how bad the shaking
was, and it was really, really bad. And when those started to give as much as they were starting to give, we all sort of made the decision to move into the bathroom. We also, at that point, we still had power, so I was able to call the operator at the hotel and say, listen, we feel like water is pouring in through our windows and doors. Like, where do you suggest we go? Because we had been told in no uncertain terms, are we supposed to open any doors, because it would compromise the integrity of the building. So they said, get in your bathroom, close all the doors, lock the doors if you can, and just sit down and like wait it out in there. And it was just rattling and shaking. We could hear the wind howling. Really, the whole building was shaking. And then just as we were doing that, unfortunately, the lights went out. So that added to the terror a little bit as well. But we were obviously really glad we had each other, and everybody really did maintain as calm a head as you could in a situation like that. But it was really scary. It was because we also didn't have any updates, so we didn't know if this was as strong as it was going to get, if it was going to get worse. We also hadn't had the eye yet, so we knew we had a long ways to go. And so even though we had held up, our room had held up to that point, we did not know how it was going to hold up for 6 more hours or 8 more hours. And just with the deafening noise and everything rattling and shaking, it was really scary.
We swept all the water out the door. We had a couple of inches, but if you go outside of our hotel, the buildings across the street are missing windows and doors. The roofs have come off. There's cars that are turned upside down.
Holly Morris and Lauren Mayo from Lux Fit Wellness. We hope that they get home soon and safely. And FYI, you can watch past discussions. They're on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. We want to thank our guests for being here tonight. ABC 7 Chief Meteorologist Bob Harrigan, Sarasota City Manager Tom Barwin, and joining us by Skype, Maury Goodman, the former Director of Communications for FEMA.